I invite us to stand as we hear the gospel for today, which is according to St. Luke, the 24th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now on that same day, 2 disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. I'm going to start with just a couple of personal notes. One is don't stare at him now that I'm saying it, but you'll notice that Julian is filming today. Yesterday was a celebration here at Good Shepherd for the 10th anniversary of the founding of Canopy NWA, which is a refugee resettlement nonprofit that was started out of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church a decade ago. And so there was a huge celebration in the Alton Center yesterday with a lot of our neighbors and friends and people who have been involved in that work for the last decade, a lot of the staff and former board members and present board members, and then of course the broad community of people who have arrived in Northwest Arkansas through Canopy. It was really a lot of fun, and you can probably, or you soon will be able to find video footage online of me trying to dance with Afghan men in a circle, which didn't work out super well, but I did try. So there's that. But Julian is with Global Refuge and is doing producing a video about the development of Canopy and its anniversary, and a little bit more broadly around like um, Lutheran communities as hubs for community service innovation. So that's happening. And then this last week, and now I'm still going to talk about stuff I did, but it's going to be in relationship to this gospel lesson. We were in Maine. My daughter is going to Bowdoin next year, which is in Brunswick. And so we were on campus. And one of the things we did while we were there was we went down to the Bowdoin owns a portion of an island. If you look on a map, you'll see like Brunswick is on land, but there are like these kind of like basically like fingers that extend out into the Atlantic Ocean, which is kind of like these various sounds that are coming in of the ocean. And one of those, when you're going out of Brunswick, is like in Harpswell, and they have it's called the Schiller Center for Aquatic Studies, I think is what they call it, and it's this part of the campus that's down on that island. So we went down there because we wanted to see what is one part of the studies that she might do, and we were touring it. And they mentioned in the tour that one thing that's happening in this area, and of course, I'm guessing that a lot of you know that what Maine makes that gets consumed kind of all over, but it's a very big thing that Maine produces, is lobster. So of course, yes, there's a lot of lobstering. You see all the, they're getting ready to enter into the lobster season. But what they mentioned was that there's this one kind of grass that grows on the bottom of these waterways called eelgrass, and it has basically just disappeared in the last 4 years. It's just not there anymore. The one guy said that he had gone out like 3 seasons ago in his wetsuit and was going to go down and look at these habitats that they always study through the season, which are really good habitats for lobstering or for lobsters to live. And the grass was just gone. We found one strand. They don't actually know why the eelgrass is gone. Like, so they don't yet know that this is like has a specific cause, but it's just something changed, and it could be any number of things. There's like an invasive kind of crab that really aggressively eats a lot of stuff on the waterway floors, and it could be that, or it could be something with the change in something. At the same time, the other thing that's happening in that area, I promise I'm eventually going to get to the gospel. Okay, so at the same time, there's a big growth industry in this region that has never been there before, which is they're raising oysters. Now, they've always had lobster, and they've always had clams. A lot of the clams that you would eat in like clam chowder or whatever are going to come from this area. And if you drive up and down the coast, you're going to see these big clam farms out on the waters. But oyster is new, and they know why the oysters can grow here, and they weren't able to in the past raise these kinds of oysters, and that's because the water is warmer. And we all know why the water is warmer. And so now there's this development, like, so if you go down on the pier at the Schiller Center, the very next thing over that you can see is a really large oyster farm that's developing. So somebody owns that part of the coastline, and they've got all the equipment up for oyster farming, which has a certain kind of look on the water. And so people engage that in different ways. So we went down there, we heard this. It's always, of course, fun to hear this perspective from a university context, because they're always going to think about it from the perspective of what kinds of opportunities does this provide our students to do, studies that are examining the shifts that are occurring, and we're going to get students out here who are going to work on studying the water chemical makeup and everything else to see about the eelgrass and that kind of thing. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, I know every day, like most of us do, that the world's permanently changing because of climate change. And now this person is talking about this real concrete thing where you can look out on the water and you can see a farm that exists that didn't exist before because the world is actually changing in that way. And I mean, of course, you can name other things. I bet you, if you're a gardener, you've shifted and are looking at different timelines for when you're going to put plants out and when you're going to do seedlings. And I'm sure that the reason why I'm still doing my storytelling for you, but this also will explain to you why I'm so disorganized this morning on some levels, probably mentally, is we were flying back in on Friday night from LaGuardia, and we got to the airport at midnight in our plane in there, and the plane tried to land 3 times, and then it couldn't land, so we got diverted to Little Rock, and we landed at Little Rock at 2:30 in the morning on Saturday morning, and then they were like, "Good luck." Because the Little Rock Airport is not open at 2:30 in the morning, even a little bit. Side story to that, I'm just going to keep doing this for a little bit today because it's kind of fun. So we were like, what are we going to do? Can you take an Uber all the way to XNA and we can retrieve our cars, or how do you handle this? And I posted on Facebook at 2:30 in the morning, and I said, probably everybody's asleep, but if you were in our shoes, what would you do? And Scott and Sarah Harrell's daughter, Morgan, immediately posted and said, I'm awake, I'm a night nurse, I can drive you home. And she drove us home, which was pretty cool. So why were the storms there of that nature and type? I think we also know the answer to that question. So it's like having these kinds of impacts on us on some really broad levels. This is in the mix here. You know that it's kind of this, the motto in the gospel is, can you actually read the moment you're in? Are you paying attention to what's actually happening right in front of you? So here's the disciples, some of them walking down this road, and they encounter this stranger, and you as a reader are immediately wondering why they find him to be a stranger. You know, if you're reading this, if you're thinking about it, you would think to yourself, why don't they recognize Jesus? Why are they calling Jesus a stranger? It goes a long time with you as the reader puzzling over the disciples explaining to Jesus the events that have taken place. They even say that, like, it gives you even this like rhetorical hint that you should know. You should know that this is weird, that the disciples don't recognize him, because they say to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? This is like the height of disciple-splaining. Like, we will now explain to you the very events that happened to you, in case you didn't know about them, Jesus. And you're supposed to be like, really, as a reader, you're supposed to be like, what the heck is going on? And then finally Jesus scolds them, oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. And then he explains back to them, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, all the things about the scriptures about himself. And then he goes away, and then they have this line, this really famous line. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was walking on the road with us? So you read the whole thing, you get to the very end, and you realize they did know. They knew the whole time. Go back to it again. They're having this dialogue back and forth with the disciples explaining to Jesus the very events that happened to him. But now try to remember, because you now know, the whole time they're doing that, their hearts are burning. The whole time they're talking to him, their hearts are burning. Ask yourself, have you had moments like this, where you couldn't admit to yourself what you knew to be true? And what is a heart burning? So that's an example of, and this is why I told the story, other than the fact that I have very little to tell you today in the sermon other than what I experienced this last week, because I'm still processing everything from last week. But it's really weird to be in a situation where you're super excited for your daughter, and you're amazed at what colleges do, because they do really cool things. And at the same time you're there, you're thinking to yourself, everything that they're studying here, there are these glaring warning signs about what's changing and what will continue to change, because the world won't wake up to the climate crisis. And how do I deal with all of that? And so the way you deal with it is you go down to the pier and you take photos of the boats and you have a good time and you get excited about the year, and yet always at the same time there's that other feeling. And this is what the disciples were experiencing before they finally were willing to admit. Also interesting in this story is they're not willing to admit the feeling they have in their own hearts until Jesus is actually gone. I think this is also a feeling that many of us have had at some times, which is sometimes it's just too much in the moment. It's just so overwhelming that you're just not even going to be willing to touch the feeling part of it, because what's happening to you in that moment is just already so much. You feel like you're going to melt or evaporate or something. So, in this case, what happens, it's really a bizarre story if you think about it. It's hard to even know what to do with it sometimes. They sit down at table, they have the bread, this bread is broken by Jesus. He gives them the bread. And if you're taking this event literally, like try to imagine what happens in the gospel, their eyes were opened, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. This is really weird. When they finally can see him, he disappears. There's a whole thing about recognition in these texts, which is also fascinating. the difference between seeing something and recognizing it, which sometimes people jokingly symbolize by, I wasn't wearing my glasses, and then you put your glasses on so you can see it clearly. But in this case, it's recognition in the sense of actually knowing what you're looking at. So they've been looking at Jesus this whole time, right down to when he's getting the bread ready. So it's not that they haven't seen him, but when they recognize him, they recognize who he is, what their past relationship was with him. This happened to me the other day, actually, the Wednesday before Easter. A young girl, and her friend came to help us stuff the Easter eggs for Easter. And it's a girl who went to this church when she was much younger, but now lives up in like Bentonville and just doesn't come down here as much anymore. And she came because she needed volunteer hours. So she comes down and she comes into the room and she's like starting to help with the Easter eggs. And I said to her, how did you hear about helping with the Easter eggs? And then she said her name. And like my whole vision of her changed. Like I was like, until then, she was just like a random 17-year-old girl that had walked in who I didn't know. And then all of a sudden it was her mapped onto like the 10-year-old that I knew. And I was like, oh, this is who's here. And all of that history kind of came in at once. It was slightly embarrassing. I was puzzled why I didn't recognize her, because as soon as I put it all together, then I did recognize her. And she was like looking at me like, why don't you know who I am? Like all this kind of stuff. And then who she had been to me until I recognized her, that vanished. I could no longer look at her as a stranger, because now she's the person that's standing in front of me that I have this whole history with. So this is what happens. They recognize him. This is Jesus. But in our experience, most of the time when this happens, then the person is still there, and you have to deal with now I really recognize the situation, and then they stay, and then you have to move on from there. In this story, once he's recognized, he vanishes from their sight. And so then they have to talk only with themselves about how to process it. And that's when they get to were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road. And then a super important part. And man, I gotta say, I'm getting increasingly annoyed with this, to be honest. In whatever we want to call progressive or liberal Christianity, the serious disinterest with the Bible as a holy text, it's becoming increasingly annoying to me. The Bible is really cool and interesting and powerful and life-changing. And one of the things that's going on in here is the recognition that comes because Jesus interprets his resurrection to them in light of Scripture. So remember, a little earlier, after they had disciple-splained to Jesus everything that had happened, I know later today you're not going to remember anything from the sermon except for you're going to start using the term disciple-splaining. But they tell him all the events. He says, the text says, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the Scriptures. What's of interest to Jesus in his resurrection and his presence with the disciples prior to them recognizing him is to explain his resurrection in light of the Scriptures. What Scriptures? Not Acts, Luke, Mark, John, Matthew, Paul's epistles that don't even exist yet, Revelation, none of that stuff, right? The Scriptures that he's interpreting his resurrection in light of are the Hebrew Scriptures. So the most important thing to Jesus when he's present with his friends, the disciples, in his resurrection is to be with them, break bread with them, yes, but help them see clearly how his resurrection is a fulfillment of or directly connected to the Hebrew scriptures they all love. So he does that. And so then they refer back to that. So it's the full sentence that they say rhetorically, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, include while he was opening the scriptures to us. There is a way in which you could say, I think this is really probably valid, this is the theological point. In some ways, you do not need Jesus' continuing presence with you after you recognize that Jesus is raised from the dead, because he's with you right in the texts. This is what this gospel is doing, whether you like it or not. It's saying, the resurrected Christ is present to you. Where do you meet the resurrected Christ? Where do you come to a recognition of him? In the scriptures. I think then, going back and kind of mapping all of this together, and then I'll stop, is if we're thinking about that in relationship to what I mentioned, we went back to the campus the next day. The students at Bowdoin organized a big Earth Day celebration on campus. So there was a big event. In general, people in Maine are doing a much better job of addressing climate change than Arkansans are. Like, way better. There's a much more profound awareness and practices in place. And so there was a lot at that fair that was like witnessing to those various kinds of practices that the student body is engaged in. I mean, like some really large percentage of the student body at Bowdoin is directly involved in stuff related to environmental advocacy. And so we went around and saw, the different things that they're doing in relationship to the trees on campus and energy consumption reduction efforts and a lot of different things like that. There are steps. There's a way of kind of traveling along this road where you get to different stages. And this was a new one for me that I'll just leave you with, was that every time we are hearing about these different things related to climate change, they become like new opportunities to think about how we're going to relate to the world differently. Some of them you simply have to be adaptive around. Others of them are probably, yes, in fact, alarming. And in the midst of all of them, there's this kind of sense of and are you going to do something, but also are you going to live in community with people who trust God? Amen.